Processo de escolha de uma foto dentro do MoMA. Você tem que compartilhar com sua equipe, você imagina que tem um processo. Você pode compartilhar conosco, por favor?
Sure. We definitely have a process. It involves many steps. The first step that I spoke of earlier is our review of our strategic priorities, so that overall we look at our acquisitions and we see how they support those strategic priorities. That's the first. But I think you were also asking about how does it work? Like, when I see something I like, then what? So let's say I see a work that I like and it does fit, it's part of a strategic priority. What I will do is I'll go to my colleagues, and in photography there are really three of us who make the acquisition decisions. My boss, Quentin Bajac, is the chief curator. So truly, actually most of the time I'll just go to him and I'll say, Quentin, isn't this great? Don't we need to have it? And it depends on how much it costs. If it's not that expensive, he'll say, sure, great. We can propose that for acquisition. If it's very expensive, he'll say, can you raise the money? And then I have to get to work to try to raise the money. So we have acquisition funds, endowed funds. We also have a committee on photography, and that committee is actually legally responsible for approving the acquisitions that we propose to them. So 3 times a year, we meet and we show our committee all of the photographs that we want to buy. And we say, these are so important for this reason, these are so important for this reason, we have to get these for this reason. And they make the decision. They say accept, or they say no. Thankfully, by the time we get to that point, with all of the research that we've done for our strategic review, with all of the research that we do when I propose something to my boss and I say we need this, and then with all of the research we do when it comes to the museum, by the time we go to the committee, we're very persuasive. We really try, and they rarely say no because they know that we've been doing our homework and that we're serious by that point. But they are allowed to say no, and we always, whenever we work with a dealer, we say, we would like to propose this for acquisition, but not until after that meeting is it approved. You know, and I think I'm lucky at MoMA that there's not only a very generous group of trustees and committee members whom I call and write a lot and ask for money, but there are also funds. So one of the important funds that allows me to present Brazilian work or Latin American work is something called the Latin American and Caribbean Fund. And this was started by a trustee at the museum named Patty Cisneros. And it's an extraordinarily important way that allows me to take an acquisition, and before I bring it to the Committee on Photography, I first present it to the Latin American and Caribbean Fund, and they have been very supportive. Not everything. Sometimes we say, okay, we'll go 50-50 or something like that. But they have been very, very supportive of our acquisition initiatives. And again, I have to make the same case. So I make the argument to them, then I make the argument to the committee, and I've been lucky that it's gone pretty well so far.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. But it's the Museum of Modern Art. It's my job, so I don't mind.
Thank you. And who have the last word?
What's that?
Quem tem a última palavra? Na aquisição. Não, na aquisição.
Oh, who has the last word for acquisitions? Well, it's interesting. I mean, ultimately the committee has the last word, because if they don't say yes, it won't happen. But I work very closely with Quentin, and you know, if I feel so strongly about something, I'm rarely not able to convince him that we really, really need it. But he's my boss, so he has the last word in that.
Okay. Sarah, question. Nesse próximo projeto que você vai desenvolver, vocês chamam de eles gostam do mundo real. Existe uma volta, você entende que estamos passando por um momento de uma volta à imagem documentária, ao documentário, e o que você entende por real? Já que a fotografia também permite e tem, fundamentalmente, um olhar extremamente subjetivo.
So when you say they like the real world, that is the title of the essay that I wrote for my chapter in photography at MoMA 1960 to now, in case somebody doesn't understand So this chapter that I was talking about documentary practices, the title of my essay is, quote, "They like the real world," end quote, documentary practices after the Americans. And what I mean by that, they like the real world, and the quote refers back to John Cherkovsky's wall text for that exhibition that I mentioned, New Documents, where he's saying they like the real world for all its frailties and imperfections. And so later in my essay, I quote the whole quote a big part of the wall text. Photography has an indexical relationship to the real world, and this is true in the digital, in the digital interpretation of that, in the analog version, and I think that photographers then and now explore that real world in a myriad of different ways. I think the notion of the obsession with the archive, which I think you see a lot in the fair, which I also see in a lot of international practices, which I think is really interesting, that mining of archives is an expression of an interest in the real world, in the real world's history, as much as a photographer who's looking out at the world around them and making a personal statement from that. So, it's almost like photography, love it or leave it. The real world is there, and that's what's in front of you. And some love it, and some leave it. There are also, I should say, some really interesting digital practices that are completely, that are born digital, that have nothing to do with the real world at all. But like Thomas Roof, let's say. But I think that those practices also, in some ways, by turning their back on the real world, it's inescapable with photography. And, that's okay with me. I leave it to the artists too. But I have seen interesting work that engages with that notion in many different ways.
Sarah, eu gostaria que você falasse um minuto sobre se vocês se debruçam, às vezes, sobre trabalhos que não foram impressos. Isso eu quero dizer o seguinte, por exemplo, George Love, um fotógrafo americano que morou no Brasil, foi uma influência importante, deixou muito pouca coisa printed. Os arquivos dele estão nas mãos de algumas pessoas. Se alguma vez vocês vão atrás também de arquivos que não estão formatados ou ampliados, ou simplesmente trabalham sobre prints.
Well, that's a good one, João. It depends. There is only one instance in the history of the museum where MoMA has ever acquired an archive that includes negatives. And that one instance happened in 1968 when John Cherkovsky acquired the Abbott Levy collection of photographs by Eugene Atget, the French photographer. That's it. Just that once, ever, ever, ever. So that sounds pretty absolute. Like, we believe that there, just like there is interpretation that happens, the real world, there's a lot of things that photographers do to put the real world into their pictures, and all of those choices they make in exposing the negative, and all of those choices that they make historically in printing that negative, what size, on what paper, how to crop it, all of those things make a work of art that I, lucky curator, get to respond to, care for, and that. So really, in an ideal world, photographers will have an opportunity to reflect and to edit their work to what they would really call their work. But of course, it's never so simple as that. You look at a photographer like Gary Winogrand, who died with tens of thousands of undeveloped negatives. So these aren't even, he didn't make a contact sheet and didn't choose. He hadn't even put them through the chemicals to develop them. And he was working in an era when that was an important part of the process. I appreciate that today it's a little, things can be very different. But in that moment, that was what a photographer did. They exposed negatives, they made prints, they made a selection of those prints, they showed them to the museum, we pick our favorite, this is how it goes. So with someone like George Love, let's say, it depends on a lot of different factors. Maybe it's easier, I'm not as familiar with that, so maybe I don't want to say too much about it, but you just have to tread carefully to look at what you can learn based on what they published, because he did publish a fair amount. How much of what he was publishing was really related to a particular project? Did he not print anything else because he wasn't interested in it? Was there a fire? I think of Otisika Fila, it's like, did it all just disappear?